It was supposed to be an ordinary royal visit. The streets were crowded, flags waved from balconies. Families gathered to catch a glimpse of the heir to one of Europe's most powerful empires. Earlier that morning, an assassin had already tried and failed. The danger seemed to have passed. The royal motorcade changed its route. By pure chance, it stopped only a few feet from a young man standing beside the road. He couldn't believe his luck. Slowly, he reached into his coat, pulled out a pistol, and fired 2 shots. Within minutes, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was dead. His wife also lay dying. Those 2 gunshots lasted barely a second, but their consequences reshaped the entire world. Within weeks, Europe's great powers declared war. What began as one assassination soon became World War I, a conflict that claimed more than 16 million lives, toppled centuries-old empires, redrew national borders, accelerated technological warfare, and changed global politics forever. History remembers the war. History remembers the assassination. But few people ever ask, how did humanity create a weapon capable of changing the fate of nations? To answer that question, we must travel back more than 1,000 years to a discovery that was never meant to become a weapon at all. The journey to the first gun did not begin on a battlefield. It did not begin inside a royal armory, nor did it begin in the workshop of a master blacksmith. Instead, it began in the quiet laboratories of ancient China, where men searched not for a weapon, but for eternal life. During the Tang dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 AD, the empire stood among the most advanced civilizations on Earth. Its cities bustled with merchants from distant lands. Its craftsmen produced remarkable inventions. Its scholars preserved enormous libraries of knowledge. And its emperors invested heavily in scientific discovery. Among the most respected scholars of the time were Taoist alchemists. These men believed that hidden within nature existed an elixir of immortality, a substance capable of extending life forever. For decades, they experimented endlessly, grinding minerals, boiling herbs, heating crystals, mixing strange powders, recording every success and every failure. Many of their experiments were dangerous. Some produced poisonous fumes. Others burst into flames. Yet they continued searching, because if they succeeded, they believed they could defeat death itself. Then, sometime during the 9th century, one experiment produced something entirely unexpected. An alchemist carefully combined 3 familiar substances: charcoal, sulfur, and a naturally occurring mineral known as saltpeter or potassium nitrate. Individually, none of these materials seemed extraordinary, but together, everything changed. The moment the mixture touched an open flame, it ignited with astonishing violence. A brilliant flash filled the room. Thick white smoke exploded outward. Flames shot across the workbench. The startled alchemists stumbled backward as burning sparks scattered in every direction. Ancient Chinese writings later described the terrifying accident with remarkable honesty, warning future experimenters that the mixture could burn the hands and face and even set the entire house ablaze. The search for everlasting life had accidentally uncovered one of humanity's most influential discoveries. The strange black powder fascinated the scholars, not because it promised immortality, but because nothing they had ever created behaved quite like it. Unlike ordinary fire, this mysterious mixture released its energy almost instantly. It burned hotter, faster, and far more violently. At first, the discovery remained little more than scientific curiosity. There was no thought of war, no dream of conquest. Instead, craftsmen began using the powder to entertain. They packed it into hollow bamboo tubes. When ignited, the tubes burst with brilliant flashes, loud bangs, and showers of glowing sparks. Soon, fireworks became an essential part of Chinese celebrations. Imperial birthdays, religious festivals, wedding ceremonies, New Year celebrations. Entire cities gathered beneath the night sky to watch dazzling explosions illuminate the darkness. To ordinary people, the powder represented joy, celebration, good fortune, and protection from evil spirits. For nearly a century, that was all it seemed destined to become, a spectacular invention created purely to inspire wonder. But while crowds admired its beauty, others began noticing something very different. Military engineers, border commanders, imperial generals. They watched the exploding bamboo tubes, and one question quietly entered their minds. If this extraordinary powder could launch fire into the sky, could it also launch something at an enemy? That single question would begin one of the greatest military revolutions in human history. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind the everyday things we often take for granted, you'll feel right at home here. We're on a mission to grow this community of history lovers to 1,000 subscribers this month, and your support would mean the world to us. So, if you're enjoying this journey, take a second to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the extraordinary histories behind the objects, inventions, foods, and discoveries that quietly shaped our world. Now, let's go back to where our story continues. In the decades that followed, Chinese military engineers would transform festival fireworks into terrifying weapons. The world's first fire lances would appear. Primitive bombs would shake battlefields, and humanity would take its very first steps toward the invention of the gun. The question that had begun inside the workshops of medieval China was no longer theoretical. If a tube could produce fire, could that fire be carried into battle? The answer would soon become impossible to ignore. At first, the transformation was surprisingly simple. The same principle that had made fireworks explode in the night sky was adapted for the battlefield. Instead of being used purely for spectacle, gunpowder-powered devices were attached to long wooden shafts. These early weapons became known as fire lances. They were crude compared with the firearms that would eventually follow, but they represented something revolutionary. For the first time, a soldier could carry a tube that suddenly produced fire, smoke, noise, and a violent burst of energy at the command of its user. The weapon did not yet resemble the guns we recognize today. There was no sophisticated barrel, no carefully engineered firing mechanism, no cartridge, no trigger in the modern sense. It was still a primitive device, but its psychological effect on a battlefield could be enormous. Imagine standing in a medieval army, surrounded by thousands of soldiers carrying swords, spears, bows, and shields. Then suddenly, a line of soldiers raises strange wooden shafts. A flash erupts, smoke rolls across the battlefield, the sound echoes through the formation. For soldiers who had never encountered anything like it before, the experience must have been terrifying. And this was only the beginning. The fire lance continued to evolve. Some versions were designed to produce flames and smoke. Others incorporated small projectiles that could be propelled forward by the force of the gunpowder. The distinction between a burning tube and a projectile weapon was beginning to disappear. And that distinction mattered, because once people discovered that gunpowder could push an object forward, they had discovered the fundamental principle behind the firearm. But the battlefield demanded more than fire. It demanded destruction. So engineers experimented with another possibility: explosive containers. Ceramic and metal vessels could be filled with gunpowder and used against enemy formations and fortifications. When they burst, they produced something medieval armies had rarely encountered before: a weapon whose destructive force did not entirely depend on the strength of the person carrying it. Gunpowder was becoming more than an ingredient. It was becoming a military technology. And as these weapons appeared on the battlefields, their reputation spread. Armies began adapting. Defensive walls were no longer completely secure. Large formations could no longer rely entirely on traditional weapons, and commanders were forced to consider a new kind of battlefield, one where fire itself could be carried by a soldier. But the most important breakthrough had not yet arrived. The fire lance still depended heavily on a burning charge. The next generation would go further. Instead of simply producing fire, the weapon would propel a projectile through a tube, and somewhere along that journey, the firework would finally become a gun. The invention had begun in China. But inventions do not remain where they are born. They travel. Sometimes through merchants, sometimes through travelers, sometimes through armies, and sometimes through people who have seen something on a distant battlefield and realized that it could change their own. By the 13th century, gunpowder technology was beginning to move beyond China. The routes connecting east and west were already carrying silk, spices, metals, horses, manuscripts, and ideas across enormous distances. Now another kind of knowledge was joining them, the knowledge of explosive weapons. As Mongol armies moved across Asia, they encountered civilizations with different military traditions and technologies. Gunpowder weapons became part of this wider exchange, and this mattered enormously, because the Mongol world connected territories that had previously been separated by vast distances: China, Central Asia, Persia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe. Ideas could now travel across these regions with unprecedented speed. Gunpowder was one of them. But the technology did not simply move west unchanged. Each civilization that encountered it adapted it to its own needs. Persian and Islamic world engineers experimented with gunpowder weapons. Military writers began recording their use. Craftsmen developed new forms of explosive devices and projectile weapons, and gradually, firearms became part of a much larger military tradition. Then came the Middle East. Here, gunpowder technology encountered powerful states with enormous armies, fortified cities, professional soldiers, and sophisticated traditions of siege warfare. The potential was obvious. A weapon that could hurl a projectile through an explosion could challenge fortifications that had dominated warfare for centuries. But there was still a problem. Early guns were awkward. They were heavy, they were slow, and accuracy was often poor. An archer could fire repeatedly, a crossbowman could reload more predictably, an early gunner might fire only once and then struggle to prepare the weapon again. So why continue developing them? Because gunpowder possessed something traditional weapons could not easily reproduce: raw explosive power. A single projectile launched from a gun could strike with tremendous force, and as metallurgy improved, so did the weapons. Tubes became stronger, projectiles became more consistent, manufacturing became more sophisticated. The technology was slowly becoming practical. Then gunpowder crossed another major boundary. It entered Europe. By the 14th century, European armies were experimenting with early firearms. At first, these weapons looked almost primitive: heavy metal tubes, simple wooden supports, basic ignition systems. Nothing about them suggested the sleek firearms that would eventually dominate battlefields. But European military engineers recognized their potential, and Europe was about to become one of the greatest laboratories for gunpowder warfare in history. The old medieval battlefield was already changing. Castles had dominated Europe for centuries. Their thick stone walls could resist swords, arrows, and siege engines. But gunpowder artillery presented a completely different challenge. A cannon did not need to climb a wall. It did not need to overpower a gate with human strength. It could simply bombard the structure, again and again and again. The consequences were enormous. Fortifications that had once seemed almost impossible to conquer began requiring new designs. Walls became lower, thicker, more angular. Defensive structures began incorporating shapes specifically designed to withstand artillery. The medieval castle was beginning to evolve into something new, the gunpowder fortress. And while artillery was transforming the siege, handheld firearms were transforming the soldier. The earliest hand cannons were gradually replaced by more practical weapons, and then came one of the most important developments in the history of firearms, the matchlock. Instead of manually applying a flame to the gunpowder every time the weapon was fired, a simple mechanical system allowed a burning match to ignite the charge. It sounds like a small improvement. It wasn't. It changed how a soldier interacted with the weapon. The firearm could now be held more deliberately. Aiming became easier, firing became more consistent, and training an ordinary soldier to operate one became increasingly practical. This created a profound military advantage. An archer could spend years mastering his craft. A skilled bowman needed strength, discipline, and constant practice. But firearms offered something different. With sufficient training, a relatively ordinary soldier could operate a weapon capable of delivering enormous force. And that changed the economics of warfare. Kings and rulers began asking a new question. What if armies no longer depended primarily on elite warriors? What if thousands of ordinary soldiers could be equipped with firearms? The answer would reshape the world. Because the gun was no longer merely an invention, it was becoming a system. Factories would eventually produce it. Governments would regulate it. Armies would organize around it. And entire empires would build their military power upon it. But before that happened, one final transformation had to occur. The firearm needed to become faster, more reliable, easier to reload, and easier to carry. That would lead to the rise of the musket. And once the musket entered the battlefield, the age of the medieval warrior would begin giving way to the age of the gunpowder soldier.
Ram your powder! Shoulder!
The gun had already changed the battlefield. But during the 16th century, something even more important happened. Armies learned that the true power of firearms wasn't necessarily in one gun. It was in many guns working together. Soldiers began drilling in formations. One group would fire while another prepared. Then the first group would reload as the next moved forward. Slowly, firearms became more than weapons carried by individual soldiers. They became the foundation of organized infantry warfare. And this created a serious problem for the old warrior. For centuries, heavily armored soldiers had dominated European battlefields. But a firearm did not care how skilled a swordsman was. It did not care how expensive his armor was. The projectile simply had to reach its target. Armor, therefore, began to change, and so did the battlefield. The same thing happened to castles. Medieval fortresses had been built to resist arrows, ladders, and traditional siege engines. But artillery presented a completely different challenge. A cannon could bombard a wall from a distance. So fortresses became lower, their walls became thicker. Defensive structures became angular with broad earthworks and projecting positions designed to withstand artillery. The gun and the fortress had entered a technological race. Every improvement in artillery demanded stronger defenses, and stronger defenses demanded more powerful artillery. But firearms created another revolution that was less obvious. They became expensive. An army needed guns, ammunition, gunpowder, metal workers, storage facilities, transportation, and trained soldiers. This meant that warfare increasingly depended on something larger than individual warriors. It depended on organized states. Governments established arsenals, weapons workshops expanded, military supply systems became more sophisticated, and rulers could now equip enormous numbers of soldiers with firearms. The gun was helping transform the army, and in the process, helping transform the state itself. Then firearms began crossing oceans. European ships carried cannons across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. A ship was no longer simply a vessel for transportation. It could become a floating artillery platform. Firearms also spread across Asia. In the Ottoman world, South Asia, and Japan, rulers and military commanders adapted firearms to their own traditions. In Japan, firearms arrived during the 16th century and were rapidly adopted and manufactured locally. Across different civilizations, the same basic idea was being transformed in different ways. But another change was coming. Firearms were becoming smaller, more portable, and more practical. The pistol gave individuals a firearm that could be carried more easily than a musket. Then came improvements in ignition systems. The old burning match was eventually replaced by mechanisms such as the flintlock, making firearms easier to carry and more dependable in battle. And now the gun was entering a completely different age. For centuries, firearms had largely been handcrafted by skilled workers, but industrialization would change that. Machines would make metalworking faster, manufacturing would become more precise, and firearms could eventually be produced in enormous numbers. That was the moment the gun's influence exploded. It was no longer simply a weapon used by soldiers. It was becoming a product of industry, and industry was about to give the gun something it had never possessed before: speed. Because the next generation of firearms would not simply fire faster, they would transform warfare itself. For centuries, firearms had been getting better, but they still had one enormous weakness. They were slow. A soldier could fire, then reload, then fire again. In the middle of battle, those seconds mattered. But during the 19th century, engineers began solving the problem that had frustrated firearm designers for generations. How could a gun fire again and again without being manually reloaded after every shot? The answer began appearing in several forms. One of the most important was the revolver. Instead of loading a single chamber, a revolver carried several chambers arranged inside a cylinder. After one shot, the cylinder could rotate. Another chamber moved into position. The gun could fire again. For the first time, a practical repeating firearm was becoming possible. Then came another breakthrough: the invention of reliable metallic cartridges. Instead of separately handling powder, projectile, and ignition material, the ammunition could be contained together. Loading became faster, firearms became more reliable, and the possibilities multiplied. But the biggest transformation was still coming: the rifle. Earlier firearms were often inaccurate at long distances. Rifling changed that. Inside the barrel were carefully cut grooves that caused the projectile to spin as it traveled. That spinning improved stability, and suddenly a firearm could reach targets with far greater accuracy. The battlefield became more dangerous. Soldiers could engage targets from distances that earlier generations of warriors could barely have imagined. Then, industrial manufacturing pushed everything even further. Factories could produce firearms with standardized parts. Weapons became easier to repair. A damaged component could be replaced instead of an entire firearm being rebuilt by a specialist. The gun was no longer simply the product of a craftsman's hands. It was becoming the product of an industrial system. And then came the weapon that truly changed the meaning of rapid fire: the machine gun. Instead of requiring a soldier to manually reload after every shot, mechanical systems could feed ammunition into the weapon repeatedly. Early designs were sometimes operated by turning a hand crank. Later mechanisms became increasingly sophisticated. The result was extraordinary. A small number of soldiers could produce an enormous volume of fire, and military commanders quickly realized what that meant. The old battlefield was disappearing. Massed infantry formations that once advanced across open ground could now face concentrated, rapid fire. Military tactics had to change. Armies began digging trenches. Soldiers sought cover. Defensive positions became increasingly important. The gun had evolved from a crude tube that frightened ancient experimenters into a machine capable of reshaping entire battlefields. And then came the 20th century. Firearms became smaller, faster, more reliable, and easier to manufacture. They appeared in world wars, revolutions, colonial conflicts, civil wars, and countless other struggles. But the story of the gun is not simply a story of destruction. The same technologies that improved firearms also pushed forward metallurgy, precision manufacturing, mechanical engineering, and industrial production. The gun became one of the clearest examples of how a simple discovery can evolve far beyond the intentions of its original creators. It began with an ancient search for something completely different: immortality. Instead, humanity discovered gunpowder, and from that discovery came fireworks, fire lances, cannons, muskets, rifles, revolvers, and eventually the modern firearm. Nearly 1,000 years after the first experiments with explosive powder, the journey had transformed the world. And perhaps the strangest part of the story is this: the gun was never invented in a single moment. It was built, one discovery at a time.